And it's almost like they broke it in half and stuck a bunch of stuff in there just to kind of explain things. There were narratives they felt like they needed to stick in somewhere, like the narrative of Sodom, the narrative of Lot and his descendants, before they moved on with the Abraham narrative, right? And so my mind was initially taken back to, I don't know if you've ever read the Epic of Gilgamesh. We've brought it up a couple of times.
Actually, yes, I have.
Which version did you read?
The one that's English.
Right. I asked that question because there's roughly 15 versions of the Epic of Gilgamesh. The problem is that the Epic of Gilgamesh was being edited for 2,000 years, and so the earliest versions, there's only like 8 tablets worth of text, and it's a pretty cohesive story with not a lot of interludes and not a lot of extra detail that doesn't seem like it serves a purpose to the story. But when you get, say, into the 8th century and the 7th century, and we read the Assyrian versions of the Epic of Gilgamesh, there's a ton of added detail. There's like roughly 10 times the number of lines of text in that version as the original Old Babylonian version.
So those were added not by the original author, which means they should not be there.
These like meta narratives in the ancient world, they were so well known and they were so revered from one generation to another that as relevant information came, relevant stories came to be important to a particular people culture, they would stuff that story into a larger meta narrative. So, for example, there's a story about Gilgamesh and Enkidu going to the cedar forests of Lebanon to cut down one of the cedars of God. So that story doesn't exist in all of the Gilgamesh epics. That actually comes later. It's a short story that gets stuffed into the Gilgamesh epic as part of an explainer, just like there's a portion of the Gilgamesh epic that explains death, and there's a portion of the Gilgamesh epic that explains why or why not human beings can't live forever. There's lots of explainers within the Epic of Gilgamesh because the goal of the meta-narrative is to allow it to speak to all of the issues that people would have questions about. I feel is a lot like a meta-narrative, an overarching narrative, kind of like the Epic of Gilgamesh. And these were stories that people believed to be true. But in order to make it a cohesive storyline, they had to stuff these smaller stories into the larger narrative. Because what do you do when you pass down a narrative? You try to pass down the bulk of the story as much as you can remember to your children. I guess what I'm suggesting is that the patriarch narratives of Genesis were so large and so widespread that they lent themselves easily to being treated as though they were a definitive source of information. And so when you go to add new information to the traditional text, to the text that gives your nation identity, you stuff it into the existing narrative that explains your people group. Just like if you have a spending bill, you have to pass a spending bill through Congress. It's got a deadline of July. It's a must-pass bill or the government shuts down. What do? They stuff all kinds of pork into it. They stuff all kinds of stuff that has nothing to do with budgeting into that bill just because they know it has to pass, right? Mm-hmm. They might fight over it, and some stuff might be removed and re-added and whatnot. But that's the way it's treated. They use this necessary must-have item, and then they stuff it with all sorts of smaller items that they feel need to be included. And I think the patriarchal narratives, just like Gilgamesh, is a bit like that. We have this overarching narrative that is a good explanation and a good history for a people group, but over the course of time, people want to narrative stuff that narrative with extra information that may not have been relevant to the original audience, but they feel like is relevant to them now. And that's why I feel like so much of this narrative that we've had with Abraham has like these side stories. Even though you could actually cut all those side stories out and the Abraham narrative reads much cleaner.